An original from Story Studio Network.
She's an innovator. He's a problem solver. And they don't rely solely on textbooks. They apply the science of generations of experience. Learn from grandparents who planted the seedlings, leaving a legacy for generations not yet imagined. They nurture nature and can only see the forest for the trees. This podcast series tells their story. Welcome to Forestry Uncut.
I can't help but think this story, the true uncut story of forestry, it's enormous. Not to extend the metaphor too far, but it really is like a tree. So many limbs, branches, perspectives, nuances. Every question that's answered is just met with another question. I mean, at some point, it all becomes quite philosophical, existential even. Scientists all agree plants and trees existed on the planet well before any signs of human life. There is an intelligence in the trees that is beyond our comprehension. Might be why humans have an inexplicable draw to the forest, to nature. Because at the root of this story, pun absolutely intended, is the fact that our reliance on trees and our relationship with nature is primal. It's partly instinctual. Think about the cavemen, Neanderthals, Cro-Magnon, early descendants of apes who found the power of fire by burning wood. Burning wood. What I'm coming to see is our narratives around forestry have become so distorted that our base reaction is to think of burning wood as a bad thing. But since the dawn of measured time, burning wood has meant heat. It's equated with food, survival, and indeed, development of civilization. It's not lost on me that I come to this mind-bending epiphany while sitting in a comfy chair by the fire in the lobby at White Point. Beside me is Robin Barrett. He's a small woodlot owner with property near Halifax. He's got a lot of different ways he works with trees and wood and harvesting to generate an income. But I'm most interested in this connection he has to the forest itself. Why, despite it being a tough business with hard hours, challenging market conditions, and very little economic support, he still gets up nearly every day to cut down trees.
I think it's very valuable to provide some of the basic services for people. Like, one of the things that I find the most rewarding is our firewood operation, where we do cut and split firewood. Because there are many people who, especially low income, especially seniors, that it is the most affordable. We had one of the customers come in and said he did the math on what it cost him for oil versus what it cost him for wood. And basically, on a BTU to BTU basis, he could pay over $1,000 a cord to be on the same basis as it was costing for him in oil. Oil has some convenience to it. But for a lot of our customers, the handling of the firewood is part of their sanity. It gives them sense of control. It gives them something that they can relax doing. And for others, it saves them on a gym membership. But, this is, it's only part of our business, but it's a part that, as I say, gives me some of the most smiles because it's a place I know we are doing a lot of good for a lot of people. and giving them an ability to get heating at an affordable cost in as close to greenhouse neutral as you're likely going to get.
And there's something too about like the connectedness to the resource and the earth, and like there's nothing more primal than lighting a piece of wood on fire.
It's therapeutic.
There's nothing more primal than lighting a piece of wood on fire. It's like we've known it in our psyches forever. But somewhere along the way, we complicated the math. It got messy, and we forgot that our most basic resource can be the solution to most of our biggest problems. For context, dear listener, as Robin shared his insightful nugget with me, Nova Scotia had just been dumped with an historic snowfall in early February. Close to 80 centimeters doused almost the entire province over the course of 2 days. The airport shut down, major highways were a mess, and it was bitterly cold.
Despite all of we hear about global warming, one of the things we still don't really talk about that much is more people die from extreme cold than extreme heat. So,
sitting with Stephen Moore, the Executive Director of Forest Nova Scotia, he once again puts this whole issue of cold more bluntly.
if we have populations of people living in places with very cold temperatures, with unreliable energy supplies and unreliable grids, then we're really dangling for disaster with that, because it's not a good recipe for human longevity.
I say all of this because I think this is where we're touching the true root of the story. We can't talk about forestry, labor, rural-urban economies, or even wildfire fallout without talking about the very Canadian issue of heat. And as Robin pointed out, the easiest, most natural way to produce heat is to burn wood. Stephen and I caught up with Jamie Stephen. Now, he's the managing director at Torchlight BioResources, and he just happens to live on the south shore of Nova Scotia. Jamie takes this conversation about our need for heat to a new level. And I need you to hear this, because in short order, you'll hear our conversation shift from, quote, we need to heat our homes and here's how to do it with wood, to, quote, here's how indulging this primal ability to burn wood creates huge economic value for our local and regional economies.
So I think the heat question is really an important one, because Canada is really the by far the largest heat consumer in the world per capita. We on the building side, and that's two things. So it's buildings and it's industry. And on the building side, we're a very cold country. And we generally have bigger homes than the Europeans, right? So the only countries that can compare even within the same range to us in building heat consumption are Sweden, Finland, Norway, right? When it comes to industrial heat, again, we are the largest per capita industrial heat consumer in the world, because we're a quite heavy industry dependent country, and things like the oil sands consume a huge amount of heat. About 85% of industrial energy consumption is actually heat. So overall in Canada, 2/3 of our energy consumption is heat. And we spend 95% of the time talking about electricity. And most of this heat is not going to be electrified. In Alberta, for example, electricity is 7% of energy consumption. So talking about trying to electrify even space heating for homes just simply will not work. So, it's great. Look, I love California, but trying to talk about decarbonization using California solutions is not going to work in Canada. We need to look at other developed northern countries. And for the most part, that is the Nordics. And secondly, Germanic countries. So Austria and colder parts of Germany. That's what's, they provide the examples of being successful. And that's why in the EU, 60% of renewable energy is bioenergy, and the vast majority of that is bioheat.
I think one of the things that's always frustrating for me is that, as James said, we have these technologies that are working, proven in other jurisdictions that are in other places that are very similar to where we live. But for some reason, we don't seem to want to just take what we know works elsewhere and bring it here. We really have this desire to create, to chase some dream technology that's not yet proven, that's somehow going to magically lift us out of the bind we've gotten ourselves into for both energy and heat supply. I realize they're the same thing, but I always will explicitly name those two because I don't think a lot of people think of them differently. But we've gotten ourselves into such a bind where we have the provincial government at odds with the energy monopoly in the province. The monopoly, I mean, they're bringing in some bills that they hope are going to fix it, but still, Emera has shipped its capital out of province. We need upgrades to our grid. We have to increase, according to Emera, we're expecting to increase supply into the grid by 60% over the next couple of decades, but yet we can't have salty fog in the province or a massive chunk of Nova Scotians go without electricity. So, we have this really horrendous system that's set up right now where we have a drive to demand electrification on a grid that's unstable with today's demand, let alone future demand. And we're chasing all of these technologies that aren't proven, that are generally a decade or more to implementation. Meanwhile, we could take something that works elsewhere and get it off the ground in, 24 to 36 months and start really addressing the issues. So it's incredibly frustrating.
As we recorded this conversation, it was a couple days after a 2-day event in the city all about smart energy solutions. Most of the narrative was about electrification and encouraging power storage using electric cars, buses, and battery cells, things like that. Cue Stephen's eye roll. And here was his response after a good borderline evil cackle laugh.
You remember when we had to wrap electric vehicle batteries in blankets, right? Again, to Jamie's point, you can't model California here. You need to model places with similar climates.
And wait for it, because neither he nor Jamie holds back on telling us what they really think about electrification as a solution to our heat problem.
Here's the other thing that drives me absolutely crazy. None of these technologies that they're selling as smart exist without massive amounts of taxpayer subsidies. Massive, mind-boggling amounts of taxpayer subsidies. We can bring in the tech that we need to bring in. Our people aren't asking for subsidies. Heat New Glasgow doesn't need subsidies. Any of these projects that are coming in, there's a federal tax credit, which is great. But we're not asking for the government to be coming in and picking one technology over the other. We don't need the subsidies to exist. We don't need the subsidies to be economical. But for some reason, we're told that the only way to do it is these massive organizations who are getting billions of dollars to promote technology that's not going to work when it drops below minus 15. And I know we had a lot of those days. So it's just mind-boggling, infuriating, and frustrating that we keep coming back to these things that might work in warmer climates, or to other things that, we keep chasing unicorns in Nova Scotia, all this grand technology, all these things that are pre-commercial that maybe in 20 years are going to be commercially viable. But again, we're sitting here at targets that come into effect in 6 years and focused on solutions that take at least 10. And there's nobody, if anybody actually sat back and looked at that objectively and said, well, we have a 6-year deadline, but we're chasing a 10-year project implementation timeline, that's silliness. It's just mind-boggling silliness. Nova Scotians are going to be forced. They're going to see higher electricity bills, higher cost to heat their home, higher cost for the things they need. And that's when you have a province that is already the second poorest jurisdiction in North America. Jamming higher electricity costs is only a way to further poverty, not alleviate it. And we're going to get worse down that path with the plan we're on.
Jamie.
Sorry. Rein me in, Jamie.
No. Well, so let's talk electricity because we spend way too much time talking about it. So Nova Scotia is a extremely electricity poor jurisdiction. It is not Quebec, and it should not have the same decarbonization energy transition strategy as Quebec. The Premier government has already said no to the Atlantic Loop, which I think is the absolute right thing. One of the things that is not discussed is that when you create transmission infrastructure between markets, you get pricing convergence of those markets. That means that we would be competing with US states for electricity from Quebec. Guess what the electricity price in New York City is? It is 37 cents Canadian a kilowatt hour.
As of the time of this recording, the average per kilowatt hour charge in Nova Scotia is about 17.5 cents. So
that's affordable in New York City because incomes are so high, right? They essentially have like 2.5, 3 times the income per capita that we have in Nova Scotia. And a lot of them live in relatively small apartments, right? And it's warmer. So we cannot have pricing convergence with New York or Boston because incomes are too low. So that's, I think the provincial government did the right thing there. The feds also wanted the provincial government to pay for a lot of it. Doesn't make sense. You know, and all this debate about, how do we shut down coal, everything, what are we going to... The easiest way to shut down a coal-fired power plant is to reduce consumption. We're trying to add load in the form of heat pumps and EVs while trying to reduce supply. The easiest way is to try to reduce consumption. And if you're for the energy transition, if you're not going to use electricity, the only alternative for the most part is biomass. And guess what? We have an overabundance in Nova Scotia. We have rural communities that are desperate for jobs. And what we can do, instead of importing oil, importing natural gas, importing electricity, is that we can actually invest in our communities and we can ensure that the money spent on fuel stays in the region and drives economic development in those regions. The thing that the Nordics and the Germanics have right is that they focus on strong local economies and investment that ensures that the ongoing operating expenses benefit the local community. Yes, there's a capital cost up front, without a doubt. But when you look at the levelized cost of energy, of utilizing local fuels, where you can actually manage the forest to have a better, more healthy, more biodiverse forest, that's where bioheat and bioenergy really makes so much sense and has all these benefits of economic development and job creation.
it's funny you should say that, because I'm going to go visit Cassie Ledwidge in Enfield and see their whole operation. And there's two cool things happening there besides what's already happening there, is that they are going to be putting in a biofuel plant at the back of the property in partnership with another local company, with the whole game plan being what you just described, to keep the energy and all that like within the locale. They're also putting in an addition to the mill to start producing mass timber. So just to add a glimmer of hope, is that fair to say that that is a glimmer of hope, that that is a way forward? I did it again. I found my way to another question. If biomass is the most logical solution to our heat problem, and therefore electricity problem, and by association, our affordability problem, then in turn, our economic development problem. Here's the glimmer of hope. Is it in the fact that small businesses in the forestry sector are starting to invest their own resources in biofuel and biomass production? Maybe. But I still have so many other questions, too, about the Nordic philosophies, policies, and approach to forestry, energy, and development. With all that said, Cassie Ledwidge has just texted me her address. Next stop, Ledwidge Lumber. I think I'm going to need a hard hat.
Forestry Uncut is a podcast series produced by Story Studio Network for Forest, Nova Scotia, the largest, fastest-growing forestry organization in the province. Leave us a comment and a rating on the show, and be sure to share it with your network. You can follow Forest Nova Scotia on Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn. For more information about the work we do or becoming a member, visit our website at forestns.ca. Forestry Uncut is hosted and written by Aaron Trafford. Our senior producer is Becky Coles. Jen Hudson is our field producer. Our editor and executive producer is Dave Trafford. I'm Mike Trutler.
Story Studio Network.
We know podcasts.